looks like a massive gathering, quite an intimidating sight. Um, Thank you, Sporshow, and all my students who are behind this banner of the seminar for inviting me. Thanks to my esteemed colleagues, Shubhita, the head of the department, Dr. Ray, and Navnita for making it to this event. And thanks to all of you for gathering this at this hall. I'm going to begin with a bit of a disclaimer. The title is deliberately provocative, and I'm going to begin on a polemical note which is also slightly provocative, slightly probably an understatement. And it's going to be somewhat risky because these days some of these philosophical discussions might invite a lot of troubles. But I would expect this audience to be a bit patient with some of the tentative arguments I have to offer. So, as I was preparing for this lecture, and I had a brief conversation with Vishaka, and we were discussing this particular article from the web. It has a very provocative side. You can read the title of the article. This is the site of the Brahmin's feet on a lower caste person's chest, head, back. This is a scene from the Purnia district. And after I shared this particular article on my WhatsApp, I received a message from one of my Dalit friends, thinking of both of us as members of the lower caste community. He says, আমাদের লোকগুলোকেই পেটাতে হবে বেশি করে, referring to the lower caste people. এত কিছুর পরেও বামুনের পায়ের তলায় ভালোবাসার মুক্তির পথ খুঁজতে চায়। এদের লজ্জা শরম কিছু নাই না। And I want to underline the word পেটাতে হবে বেশি করে, that phrase. I'm not going to respond to these two texts, the where article and whatever my friend has texted me in the lecture today. I'm going to leave those questions for them to haunt us throughout the lecture and beyond. Now, let me begin with a bit of a methodological clearing of the ground. There are two sociologists in the front row who know more about Anthony Giddens, but I would still cite Giddens and deploy Giddens' double hermeneutics to think of the tentative methodological structure I'm going to adopt for delivering some of those arguments that I have to offer this afternoon. So the idea of double hermeneutics of Giddens refers to two-way traffic in which, in the downward hermeneutics, you have the thoughts of important thinkers in the social sciences, in philosophy, political philosophy, particularly in this context, determining how we think of our ways of being in this world. And on the upward hermeneutics, we have the dynamics, different kinds of situations, specificities of those situations, determining the subtle theoretical, philosophical contours of social sciences and political philosophy. So it's an upward kind of journey. Whatever happens in the colonies, in the subaltern areas, informing the metropolitan theorizations of the British Empire. That's where we will locate some of these discussions. Let me also outline the schema of today's lecture for your convenience. I'm going to quickly focus in the next 15 to 20 minutes or so on some of the inherent contradictions of liberalism by focusing on John Locke briefly, James Mill, Bentham, and John Stuart Mill. And this is going to be done in broad brushstrokes, so please don't put me under the guillotine for obscuring certain subtleties and differences between these thinkers. Then it will be followed by an extrapolation of certain thematic coordinates for elucidating how liberalism has got certain problems as not anomalies of the theoretical postulations of liberal philosophy, but as something that is part of the DNA of liberal thought. And then it will be followed by those thematic coordinates will help us to look deeper into how liberal political thought has been engaged with, appropriated, altered, recalibrated by Indian liberal thinkers. And I have chosen two extremely important thinkers from the Indian subcontinent, from the eastern side of the subcontinent to the western side of the subcontinent, Ram Mohan Roy and Dr. Ambedkar. There is one chronological excuse for citing these two thinkers. I was also thinking of M.M. Roy as another interlocutor in this discussion. But I had to exclude it because A, I wasn't prepared well on M.M. Roy, and B, I thought it would be too much of time to take to talk about M.M. Roy. The textual or more hermeneutical reason for talking about these three, and as I said, for the paucity of time and for the lack of my preparation, I'll talk about only two. For choosing these two thinkers is also the fact that both of them thought about what we can roughly describe as constitutional liberalism. Not many people are aware of the fact that Ram Mohan Roy also thought of an ancient Indian constitution. And I'm not going to talk about the famous text that occurred in 1946 in November at the Constituent Assembly, where Ambedkar was uttering important words of warning about the future of the Indian Constitution, because that's something that has been talked about at length. Instead, I will talk about one of the earliest public political engagements that Dr. Ambedkar had on some important coordinates that will be extrapolated from our initial discussions of liberal political thinkers like Locke, Bentham, Mill, and so on. And that text is 1919 text known as the evidence presented in front of the South Border Committee. That is the text by Ambedkar that we will refer to briefly. Because it's a longish text, almost 30 to 35 pages long, I thought of instead referring to a relatively shorter, abbreviated version of these writings by Dr. Ambedkar on the important registers that I'm going to talk about in a short while, pertaining to liberal political thought. There is a small section called Franchisee in the essential writings of Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, edited by Valerie Rodriguez and published by Oxford Institute. So that's the text that I've been referring to. So to quickly summarize the schema, I begin with the discursive contradictions inherently present in liberal political thought, citing Locke, Bentham, the Mills, and also briefly Macaulay, time permits, and then quickly extrapolate some theoretical coordinates for us to enter a discussion of Indian liberal thinkers like Ram Mohan and Ambedkar. And the textual reason, as I said, for citing Ambedkar and Ram Mohan is two moments of constitutionality in the Indian subcontinent. One early 19th century text known as modern encroachments, where in a footnote, Ram Mohan talks about modern and ancient Indian constitutions. And the other one is, of course, the 1919 text by Dr. Ambedkar. Now, let me very quickly draw your attention to some of the problems of liberal political thought. Let me begin, however, on a positive note, on a more appreciative note about liberalism by following a very convenient summing up of what liberal political thought looks like by Uday Mehta, who wrote a book called Liberalism and Empire, from which I am quoting. We rightly think of liberalism as committed to securing individual liberty and human dignity through a political caste that typically involves democratic and representative institutions, the guarantee of individual rights of property and freedom of expression, association and conscience, all of which are taken to limit the legitimate use of the authority of the state. That's a very handy, convenient summary of whatever liberal political thought looks like. But then it should be followed immediately by some of the problems of liberal political thought. Let me begin with the question that Uday Mehta raises in this book, known as the unfamiliarity of the East, of more particularly in our context of India, for the liberal thinkers. Empirically, all these liberal political thinkers, starting with Locke, Bentham, the Mills, all of them were closely associated with the question of the empire across the globe. Locke, for instance, would go on to write the constitution of the Carolina state in the United States of America. We have Bentham, extremely interested in the Bengal legislative challenges. We have the two Mills, obsessed with India, although making very disparaging comments throughout their texts that I'm going to quickly talk about in this section. At the level of discourse formation, of course, we have important coordinates that need to be, as I said, extrapolated from their writings. And we need to begin with Locke. We are all familiar with Locke's writings like the two treatises of government, where Locke talks about how governments are to be formed. There is an unmistakable question of universalism that informs Locke's thinking at this point. One of the fundamental coordinates, characteristics of liberal political thought is its universalistic premise, its trans-historical universalistic dimension. Locke is one of the earliest proponents of this liberal universalistic trans-historical, transcontinental dimension of liberal political thought. And the question of unfamiliarity, according to Mehta, is important. By the word unfamiliarity, of course, Mehta is not suggesting that these thinkers did not know much about India. In fact, quite the contrary, all these thinkers were quite well informed about India. We might, on hindsight, think that their ideas, their perceptions were clouded by racism, by lack of knowledge, ideological prejudices of all kinds. But if you give them some benefit of doubt, we can reasonably argue that they were quite well informed about the Indian subcontinent as well as the entire British Empire. So, in Mehta's argument, the idea of unfamiliarity is to be distinguished from ignorance. Ignorance and unfamiliarity are two separate categories for Mehta. By unfamiliarity, it does not mean a complete ignorance. It means that the unfamiliar is often, in this universalistic premise, brought under the scanner of familiarities. There is an interventionist paradigm within liberal political thought that tries to render the strangeness of these non-Western words. In our context, again, it is India. So this extremely alienated, multifarious life words of the Indian subcontinent, that look unfamiliar to these thinkers. At the same time, many of these political thinkers, liberal political thinkers, were directly engaged with the governance of the British Empire in India. For instance, when Lord Bentinck was about to start his journey for India, he threw a farewell party in London in the early 19th century. And the party was attended by none other than James Mill. And Bentinck famously said to James Mill that apparently I'm going to be the Governor General, but it will be James Mill who will be governing British Empire in India. So there is a direct connect that can be discursively, historically, empirically established between the empire, especially India, and liberal political thinkers and their writings that constitute the larger framework of liberal political thought. So what did these liberal thinkers do when they encountered the apparently unfamiliar, strange terrain, the terra nullius as it were, of the Indian subcontinent? They came up with two important tropes, and these are the two tropes through which we will be entering the main part of our discussion this afternoon. Locke suggests, in his universalistic transhistorical liberal anxiety, that there are these unfamiliar societies that we have to understand, study, both for practical reasons of governance or in a company, but also otherwise for the interests of the colonial enterprise. Encountering this unfamiliarity, we can have two possibilities. One possibility is the Epicurean quietude. You can do nothing about it. You simply encounter something, that's it. The other option is to be interventionist, and Lockean reminds the interventionist. In Locke's two treatises of the government, and also more importantly in our context, some thoughts concerning education, Locke comes up with the idea of the child, the infantile state of being of the human life. Locke's larger concern is certainly not India. We must remember that all of these liberal political thinkers were operating in their own ways within the context of England, while at the same time being very interested in the empire, especially in our case India. For instance, Locke was responding to the absolutism of Hobbes and Kilmer, and he was also responding to British feudalism while he was writing these texts. And he was also interested in his child's education, both as a father, but also as a political scientist, as a political thinker. So when Locke was writing some thoughts concerning education, he was basically trying to think of his child's education. And Locke thought that a child needs to be groomed well, given proper education, in order to become, and this is the important knot in our discussion, in order to eventually become matured enough as a political being. So there has to be some kind of pedagogical training enabling the child into a state of adulthood and maturity, wherein that adult individual will be able to take political decisions. In Locke's words, the ability to make these decisions should be understood by the crucial word discretion. So the adult, this political being, will have the discretionary power to be participating in the modern political world. So within the core of Lockean philosophy, the social contract idea of the social contract theory, you have this individual who has to be trained pedagogically, provided with some kind of good education. Although there are different kinds of hierarchical models of pedagogical pursuits that he has to offer in thoughts concerning education. And we can be a little polemical in attacking Locke on those grounds, but we are not doing that for the time being. Instead, we are focusing on the technicalities of Locke's thinking. So, in order for adult individual political beings to participate in the modern state formation, unlike the absolutist state in Thomas Hobbes' writings, the frontispiece of Hobbes' Leviathan was just there at the beginning of this talk. I'm sure you have seen somehow somebody was very creative to insert my name within that frontispiece picture. But quite importantly for this context and this moment, we need to remember that this adult discretionary power holding political being will be eventually entering the domain of the social contract upon which the edifice of modern state will be built. So it is important, it's quite central, quite a key to Locke's basic liberal political thought. But the idea of the child is interesting in this context. According to Mehta, the colonized world, much of the colonized world was often encoded in Locke's ideas as a child which will eventually grow into some form of adulthood or maturity. So one of the ways through which liberal political thought would deal with the problem of the unfamiliar world of the empire, of the British Empire, is to think of that world not only as alien and strange, but also in a universalistic impulse, in this trans-historical impulse, to think of that world as an immature world, as a childlike world, which needs a bit of hand-holding, and John Stuart Mill's exact words, so that they can walk into the modern political world. So that's Locke's response. We have two other important liberal political thinkers in the spectrum, Bentham and James Mill, and eventually, of course, John Stuart Mill. Bentham, when he encountered this very powerful challenge of legislating in the context of the colony, especially Bengal, he was quite astounded by the severe heterogeneity of this situation. For Bentham, we must remember it is important to have solid legislations, and while talking about Ram Mohan, I will come back to this point. It is important to form proper legislations in order to have a good society. That Benthamite utilitarian liberal political thought is something that we will stay with for some time as we enter Ram Mohan's discussion. So, Bentham adopts a particular methodology to come up with what he calls scientific legislative thought. We can roughly describe it as scientific legislative efforts. Bentham thinks that the inductive method is particularly good for creating good legislations. What is the inductive method of coming up with good legislative efforts in the context of the colony? You take into account as many empirical details as possible. You try to have an encyclopedic view of things. You take into account all kinds of customs and so on. Only to make certain generalizable principles, arrive at those generalizable principles to create the kind of legislation that will enable a solid, stable colonial governance in the colonies. But this was, as I said, an arduous, astoundingly difficult task, given the fact that they were completely unfamiliar with this part of the globe. So how would the universalist impulse in Bentham now encounter the question of unfamiliarity and then face this challenge of arriving at important legislative documents, creating legislative documents? Bentham himself, on a number of occasions, tells us that the diversities that I have to encounter as a scientific legislative mind in the context of Bengal is simply unimaginably high. So what do I do? James Mill would offer us a solution, and this solution created a massive, colossal problem for the colonized world, not just in India but also in the rest of the world. And this would again have several Hegelian similarities. Hegelian philosophy of history, that is. James Mill, in his famous History of India, in the introduction talks about the extraordinary difficulty with which he has to take up this job of writing the history of India, of British India. So he was again encountering the same problem. Bentham had already tried and tested the inductive method, did not become very effective. At this Mill, James Mill wasn't very happy with that, so Mill would offer his own formulations. Mill says that the inductive method is of no good use. Instead, let us use a deductive method, in which you begin the discursive premise with certain generic principles, guidelines, a roadmap, and of course this is a universalistic roadmap with which you try to read the specificities pertaining to the strangeness and unfamiliarity of the colonized, the other way around. This resulted in his idea of universal history, which would then be more fine-tuned by his esteemed son, John Stuart Mill, in two texts by John Stuart Mill, on liberty and his essay on representative government. In these two texts, John Stuart Mill particularly focuses on the idea of progress. John Stuart Mill is extremely unhappy with anything that is static. Mehta has a beautiful paragraph in this book, Liberalism, where he is drawing our attention to the idea of home. After a hard day of work, you return to your home space, something that does not change. So how would somebody like John Stuart Mill engage in the question of home? And I was, in the back of my mind, I was thinking of Dr. Ambedkar's famous statement to Gandhi, where Ambedkar says, Gandhiji, I do not have a homeland. And this semester, I've been discussing with some of my students of Presidency this text by Dr. Ambedkar, waiting for a visa. Visa to which place? We know that we need a visa to enter the country. And it seems that Dr. Ambedkar feels so alienated within and from his own homeland, which is supposed to be his homeland, this country of India, that he needs a visa for which he is waiting to enter his own country. This will tell us a bit more about the ironical and paradoxical engagements of Dr. Ambedkar with the liberal political thought at the very end of this lecture today. But as of now, it is important for us to see how we have two important coordinates emerging from the very brief thumbnail impression of liberal political thought that I am trying to offer, very quickly, with broad brushstrokes. The initial point of entry for us was the question of unfamiliarity, the strangeness of these alien worlds that they had colonized. And unfamiliarity had some repercussions in their thoughts, particularly, to borrow Mehta's categorization, we have two coordinates. One is what he calls inscrutability of this world, which is an extension of the question of unfamiliarity. And the second coordinate is civilizational infantilism. The civilizational infantilism, which began with Locke's Some Thoughts Concerning Education, would evolve into a more solid universal history idea in John Stuart Mill's writing through James Mill's History of British India. And once this line of thinking is quite well established, we can extrapolate two other adjoining coordinates of the political thought. Coordinates that I've already mentioned. The question of education and the idea of universal history. So we begin with unfamiliarity. Unfamiliarity leads us to two things, according to Mehta, inscrutability and civilizational infantilism. Adjoining these two coordinates, we have two other coordinates, the question of education and universal history. The idea of progress, the ideas against stasis that you find in John Stuart Mill are all coming into consideration at this point. But this idea of universal history is something that created the notion of waiting room of history. If you have to think of a child who would eventually go into a stage of maturity and adulthood, you can apply the same formula to a colonized country, which you think is civilizationally infantile, right? You can argue reasonably within that strange, liberal, reasonable mindset. You can argue that these countries need a bit of hand-holding and eventually they will mature themselves into modern political societies. Until that point, empire is okay and needed. So this tells us about the moment the native elite starts arguing that we need to have some sense of self-rule. They will be immediately told by the liberal apologists of the empire that you have got to wait, which is what Basak Auditorium and others would describe roughly as the waiting room of history. So we have this important trope of waiting room of history, and please note that underpinning this trope, we have the notion of franchise, right? Of voting rights, of deciding our political fate. We will get back to the question of waiting room of history and the question of our voting rights, the question of franchisee, as we discuss some later states. In a more pronounced form, those discussions will emerge. But for the time being, let me quickly draw your attention to Raja Ram Mohan Roy. Ram Mohan Roy, as I said, in early 19th century, the exact date is 1822, Ram Mohan wrote a tract, a treatise, right, where he says, the title of this treatise is Brief Remarks Regarding Modern Encroachments on the Ancient Rights of Females. It's a long title. Brief Remarks Regarding Modern Encroachments, it's known as modern encroachments. So, brief remarks regarding modern encroachments on the ancient rights of females according to the Hindu law of inheritance. This was in 1822. The important liberal political thinker John Stuart Mill would not occur at this point for the simple chronological reason. J.S. Mill would occur after him. But Ram is certainly founded by Bentham and James Smith, and also to some extent John Locke, but primarily Bentham. Ram Mohan, in this particular text in 1822, popularly known as Modern Encroachments, in a footnote, raises the idea of an ancient Indian constitution. Although we are dealing with roughly the time frame of early 19th century, where anti-colonial nationalism of the political kind, of the more institutional kind, more state-oriented kind, is still not very prominent. There was certainly some discussion about self-rule. So it is not, parochially speaking, a political, state-centric idea of the Indian nation-state. In that sense, it is not prominently, very pronounced anti-colonial premise, but there is certainly some discussion of self-rule that was going the rounds around Ram Mohan's time, and Ram Mohan was engaging with some of those questions. In this particular text, Ram Mohan was responding to the liberal premise, especially of James Mill, who thought that Indians are irredeemably barbaric. There is no hope for the Indians. Although the Lockean premise would think of them as children to eventually grow up, because it's a temporary phase, you eventually grow up into adulthood. But James Mill was more prejudiced, one can argue, and he thought that Indians are irredeemably infantile and backward and barbaric. Barbaric is the right exact term that he used. So Ram Mohan's larger argument, that's the ethos, that's the spirit in which Ram Mohan talks about it. Ram Mohan says that we are not irredeemably barbaric. We had our own civilizational past. Ram Mohan does not offer us a simple golden ages past, to borrow Spivak's phrase, as later day anti-colonial thinkers would do as we approach late 19th century and early 20th century. But Ram Mohan is certainly one of the pioneers to think of a civilizational past. So in responding to to James Mill's dismissive, disparaging remarks about the Indian civilization, Ram Mohan would suggest that we too had what we can roughly describe as an ancient Indian constitution in this text of 1822 called Modern Encroachments. And in that text, Ram Mohan argues that the ancient Indian constitution was based on a person's writings, although there is a huge debate on whether he was a particular individual, a name that none of us would, in our liberal hangover, would like, appreciate, Manu. So he says Manu, and also he mentions Brihaspati, to suggest that these two figures did offer us a legislative kind of a template, not a pure legislative template. We must remember, as my very dear friend Anushka Basu reminds us in his book on Hindutva as political monotheism, Manusmriti is not a legal text. To be very specific, when we understand the term legal text, it does offer us some laws or quasi-legal framework, but it's not a proper legal text in the modern sense of the term. But anyway, so Ram says that we did have an ancient Indian constitution, and that ancient Indian constitution was premised primarily on a separation between legislative power and executive power. So initially, Ram suggests the Rajputs, the warrior classes, had the executive power, and the Brahmins had a legislative power. That was fine. That was a manageable kind of legislative template according to Ram. Ram Mohan is also, by the way, responding to Bentham, who used to think that good laws will make good societies. And Ram Mohan is simultaneously contesting Bentham's liberal universalistic premise by suggesting that we did have our own kind of legislative framework, which of course has fallen into some kind of civilizational abyss, and we need to retrieve that kind of legislative framework for our betterment into the future. Please note that this argument is ultimately, in its DNA, it's a historicism, and historicism is definitely a discursive byproduct of liberal political thought. If you want to know more about what I'm referring to, you can consult the last chapter of Provincializing England by Chakraborty, where Chakraborty is talking about historicism and decisionism of Ambedkar and Gandhi. In the last chapter of, if I'm not wrong, the last section of Provincializing Europe. So historicism is something that Ram Mohan deploys here. So let's just quickly take a few steps back and see what is going on here. We have one of the first quote-unquote liberal thinkers, because we cannot conveniently designate Ram Mohan, or for that matter Ambedkar, as I will argue in a short while, liberal thinkers. We cannot conveniently label them as liberal thinkers. But for the time being, let me describe Ram Mohan as a liberal thinker. And let us take a few steps back and see what is going on. Ram Mohan is responding to both James Mill and Bentham. Ram Mohan is thinking of legislative framework as an important point to respond to Bentham, as well as civilizationally speaking, respond to James Mill. And Ram Mohan argues that we did have an ancient Indian constitution. And then he offers us a rereading and a very historicist rereading of the Bhagavad Puran and the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. In doing that, somehow Ram Mohan, in his utmost creativity, starts thinking of Parashuram as Oliver Cromwell. And Ram Mohan suggests that this wonderful ancient Indian constitution needs to be retrieved. Let us quickly recognize the fact that Ram Mohan is still operating within the broader contours of liberal political thought. This is not a radical departure of any kind from the basic regnant features of liberal political thought. But he will have a point of departure according to Ranjit Guha. Ram Mohan, shortly before he wrote Modern Encroachments in 1822, wrote two other texts. Texts that did not always have palatable statements for our liberal text. As Vishaka was pointing out last evening, there are certain things that are not very acceptable for our modern liberal prejudiced minds. And I will use the word prejudice in this context by following Hans Kolkata, but that's another kind of derivation that is not written here. So there are two documents that Ram Mohan produced. Shohomoron Vishaye, Pravartok and Nivartoker Shamba in 1818. This was followed by a second treatise, Shohomoron Vishaye, Pravartok and Nivartoker Ditiyo Shamba. But even in these tracts, Ram Mohan, despite his obsessive emphasis on logical thinking, reasoning, rational explanation through textual exegesis, ultimately focuses on something that marks the fundamental point of departure from the broader context of liberal political thought. The crucial word, according to Ranjit Guha, is Daya. Ranjit Guha says in his book Daya, Ram Mohan Ray এবং আমাদের আধুনিকতা, তবুও বিদায়, তবুও comes after an explanation of how Shastra and Jukti were deployed to create the counter arguments against the more conservative lobbies of the time. Ram Mohan has already done that. He has used primarily three weapons: Shastra, Shastra Nirbhar Jukti, Jukti on its own, and common sense. After that, Guha says, Tobuo Bidaya Gombir, and I hope all of you understand Bangla here. If you do not, please raise your hand. I will try to terribly translate these words. Tobuo Bidaya Gombir, Tobuo Bidaya Gombir, Torkaro Ujjol, Shei Karchokaron, causality. সেই কার্যকারণের সম্পর্কের মাঝে মাঝেই অতর্কিতে, প্লিজ নোট দ্য ওয়ার্ড অতর্কিতে, অ্যান্ড আই মিস সুমিতা হিয়ার, অতর্কিতে যে একটা করুণার ছায়া পড়েছে তাও মনে রাখার মতো, করুণার ছায়া পড়েছে। Ram Mohan's exact words are quoted by Guha in Daya. দুঃখ এই. So by the time he utters these words, he has won the victory. He has got the victory. He has won this battle against the conservative lobbies who are trying to argue in favor of Shotidaho. He has won the battle. There is no need for going on further, but he does. He says, দুঃখ এই যে এই পর্যন্ত অধীন নানা দুঃখে দুঃখিনী তাহার দিকে, referring to the widows, প্রত্যক্ষ দেখিয়াও কিঞ্চিত দয়া আপনাকারকে উপস্থিত হয় না, যাহাতে বন্ধনপূর্বক দাহ করা হইতে রক্ষা পায়। আপনাদের একটু দয়া হয় না? This reference to daya and karuna suggests us to think of what Mehta calls as opposed to the universalism of reason, which created the basic texture of liberal political thought, a universalism of sentiments. So, if you found in Locke's writings, in Mill's writings, in Bentham's writings, a universalism of reason, because ultimately universal history, universalist impulse of liberal political thought are all based on logical, rational, reasoning capacities, without which you cannot enter the modern political world, which is the mainstay of liberal political thought. As opposed to that, perhaps, following Mehta, we can argue, in Guha's underlining of Daya or Karuna in Ram Mohan's these two tracts, we see some points of departure into the direction of a universalism of sentiments. This is what Christopher Bailey might be thinking of as he talks about the Heideggerian life was, but we are not discussing Heidegger. Let us now quickly think of two things that we have been able to derive out of our brief engagement with Ram vis-a-vis liberal political thought. Ram Mohan, one part of Ram Mohan's thought certainly revolves to redeem the dominant liberal political thought, as long as he is responding to Bentham and Mill. But at the same time, Ram Mohan is pushing us into the direction that can be tentatively touted as the universalism of sentiments, Daya Karuna, which is, we must remember, a premise of thought and affect that is non-interfering, non-judgmental, and thus non-political. This is what we can describe as Ram Mohan's modus vivendi liberalism. Modus vivendi liberalism is about how liberal ideas are lived through the everyday negotiations that we have. This is a phrase from John Gray that is borrowed and employed by Christopher Bailey in his book Recovering Liberties. But Ram Mohan, as you know, was also trying to deploy the question of education to enable us to navigate this terrain of liberal political thought as we encountered colonial modernity at the beginning, in the first few decades of 19th century. So the question of education, the question of legislation, and the question of liberty and rights. Ram Mohan was, of course, thinking of a cosmopolitan view of things. He had his own kind of cosmopolitanism where even European traders could buy property and settle down in the city of Calcutta if they wanted to. In fact, he thought that that would enable them, that would enable the Indian economy to have more strength because the money will not go away to the European continent. So he did have his own cosmopolitanism. He was influenced by Unitarian thought, as you all know. And at the same time, he was operating within liberal political thought, but at the same time, he was making this point of departure into the direction of the universalism of sentiment. So the question of self-rule, and in turn, the question of franchising and voting rights, are already bothering us at this point. So let's quickly take a look at Dr. Ambedkar's writings. So in Ram Mohan, in short, we have, instead of John Stuart Mill's comprehensive liberalism, of course that's something that was chronologically unavailable to Ram Mohan, but on hindsight, we might, if we are a little less mindful of dates, as I am often accused of, we can think of Ram Mohan's example as modus vivendi liberalism as opposed to the comprehensive liberalism of John Stuart Mill, to summarize that in theoretical terms. But let's quickly look at what Dr. Ambedkar has to say about the question of self-rule, especially the question of franchising. Are these people trying to wait in the waiting room of history? The answer is no. Both Ram Mohan and Ambedkar. So please bear with the long quotations that I'm going to read out from Ambedkar's. Ambedkar says, my colleagues have recommended that the franchisee in urban areas should remain. This all into the pragmatics of the political world. We must remember that Ambedkar is more into the heart of an already advanced liberal premise of modern political world. And to that extent, he is certainly quite a liberal mind, as Partho Chatterjee would argue. And most in the suburban studies brigade will argue, a view that I am not comfortable with. My colleagues have recommended that the franchise in urban areas should remain as it is, and that in rural areas the land revenue assessment should be halved. I am unable to agree to this. My colleagues have treated the question of franchisee as though it was a question of favor rather than of right. So Ambedkar is still talking as a good liberal would do, that this is not a question of favor, that it is ultimately a question of rights. I think that such a view is too dangerous to be accepted as the basis of political society in any country, for if the conception of a right to representation is to be dismissed as irrelevant, if a moral claim to representation is to be deemed as nothing but a metaphysical or sentimental obstruction, if franchisee is considered a privilege to be given, or withheld by those in political power according to their own estimate of the use likely to be made of it, then it is manifest that the political emancipation of the unenfranchised will be entirely at the mercy of those that are enfranchised. It is as if he is talking about the Brexit and the European Union. Those of you who know a little bit about that context will quickly be able to connect the link, the dots. But please, let's quickly try to note the fact that Ambedkar is still talking like a good liberal. But then comes the question of education. I hope you remember that I was trying to focus on the question of education as something that was carved out from the broader contours of liberal thought. Right? So John Locke, education, thoughts concerning education, making a spectral entry into Ambedkar's writing. This is at the height of the political world, of the modern political world. Question of franchising, question of constitutional rights, the question of self-rule. So, broadly, this is the quintessential liberal premise. Let us look at what Ambedkar is doing within that quintessential liberal premise. My colleagues look upon the question of franchising, and he is referring to by my colleagues, he is of course referring to the members in the Bombay Legislative Assembly, Provincial Legislative Assembly. My colleagues look upon the question of franchising as though it was nothing but a question of competency. To put into a ballot box a piece of paper with a number of names written thereon. Otherwise, they would not have insisted upon literacy as a criteria for the extension of the franchise. So the kind of pedagogical pursuits that are extremely important according to John Locke in his some thoughts concerning education, one of the primary documents of the political thought, is being directly contradicted here. Now, before I get on to talk about this particular aspect in Ambedkar's writings, let us quickly remind ourselves of the fact that the anti-colonial nationalist premise had already made these arguments. My colleagues in Ambedkar's writing, they have already made these demands for self-rule. But quite like the British liberal thinkers, they were interested to restrict those franchisee rights to a certain section of the Indian population, propertied and educated. Ambedkar is directly attacking both the Lockean premise, which thought of education as the competency element to enter modern political world, to become adults, to have what Locke would call discretionary power. So, Ambedkar says he dissociates the question of competency to enter the modern political world from the question of education. Otherwise, they would not have insisted upon literacy as a criteria for the extension of the franchise. Such a view of the franchise is undoubtedly superficial and involves a total misunderstanding of what franchising stands for. So, anti-colonial nationalism was questioning the British liberal political thought, its mainstay, waiting room of history, something that we extrapolated from our discussions of liberal political thought. And they were insisting on the now, that we are not going to wait for our self-rule, we are not going to wait for our franchising. Give it now. But they were still doing something that the good liberals back in the metropolitan center would encourage them, expect them discursively to do. That is to say, to restrict those rights to a chosen figure. In fact, Ambedkar reminds us in this very text that in the British context, the idea of franchisee was rolled out in phases. So you have the reform bills, and thereafter subsequent stages of development where franchisee rights were rolled out ultimately to women. And Ambedkar says we don't need that document. We don't need that kind of history. So he is operating within, broadly speaking, the political thought. But he is ready to directly denounce, completely give up on the British history of the political thought that paved the way for the stagist, rolling out of franchise. So the British political thinkers might also argue in their own favor by saying that even in our country we were doing it in a stagist format. So why can't you wait? Ambedkar is completely impatient with that premise. He says, let's not even bother about English history of the thought. Let's put it in the dustbin. We will go our own way. Right? So literacy as a criteria for the extension of the franchisee, that's what we'll talk about. He says, for associated life is shared by every individual, and as every individual is affected by its consequences, every individual must have the right to settle its terms from the same premises. I'll take 10 minutes if you are already running out of questions. Must have the right to settle its terms from the same premises. It would further follow that the poorer the individual, the greater the necessity of enfranchising him. So he is turning the table upside down, arguing that those who are poor, uneducated, not property at all, are the very people who should be enfranchised, irrespective of the question of competence. And he is so tactful that he cites a very strange, unlikely thinker at this point. He talks about, and interestingly in this document, just as Ram Mohan did in his own document, Modern Encroachments in 1822, both of them talk about, and Ramoji Guha has a long section in his book, Daya, on Ram Mohan's deployment of what he calls common sense. And then, of course, Guha goes into a long discussion of how common sense in Ram Mohan is different from the metaphysics of morals in Immanuel Kant. But for the time being, we do not have the luxury to get into those details of what Guha suggests in Daya. But I wanted to quickly draw your attention to the fact that both Ram Mohan's document, Modern Encroachments, and the document that I am referring to at this point, reading out from, Franchisee in Essentialities of Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, common sense is a key term. But so, at this point, Ambedkar refers to an unlikely thinker who was completely trying to, as many elite liberals usually are fond of doing, they are very dismissive of public popular opinions. His name is James Bryce, and Bryce was also a key figure in American jurisprudence. He was not just restricted to England, he went to the United States of America, fellow of the British Association, and so on and so forth, very important figure. And he says that Bryce wrote a book called Modern Democracies, if you want to take a quick look at that text at a later point of time. He says, Bryce's argument is not similar to Ambedkar's. Bryce is on the opposite side of Ambedkar here. Bryce's primary argument is that, there is no point in educating people. Educated people are going to make even more serious mistakes in making political choices. So there is no point in making them educated. Let's not even bother about it. Ambedkar says that see a person from your side who would think of education otherwise as an element of competency to enjoy political rights in the modern political world, himself is saying, somewhat ruefully, that education cannot entirely ensure, alas, competence. So there is no need for us to be bothered about the question of competency earned through quality education to enter into the modern world. Bryce says, and I'm quoting from Bryce's book, which is extensively cited by Ambedkar himself, the Athenian voters were better fitted for civic franchisee than most of the voters in modern democracies. These Greek voters learned politics not from the printed. You see resonances of what we do at Child Dukan, Addas, and the kind of things that we talk about in commenting on Modi Mamata's politics. So he says that the Greek voters learned politics not from the printed, and few even from any written page, but by listening to accomplished orators and by talking to one another. We have dangerous accomplished orators, but certainly we can talk to each other. Talking to each other leads me back to the basic ethos of my talk this afternoon, and that's how I will conclude. So I'll talk about something that I'm obsessed with, American pragmatist philosophy. We can also bring in Franz Fanon, but there is no need. There are two citations with which I conclude. One from Uday Mehta's reference to Immanuel Levinas, as Levinas was commenting on Martin Buber. And Mehta reminds us how Immanuel Levinas is talking about this interstitial space in between, betwixt space that lies between I and an unfamiliar, strange thou, as opposed to the Epicurean ataraxia, this idea of quietude, not bothered, indifferent, quietude in that crude sense of the term, ataraxia. And as opposed to the liberal interventionist political premise, Levinas suggests, following Martin Buber, that we stay dangerously close to that adventurous space between I and thou. It is a place of adventure because it is the space where this cosmopolitanism of sentiments that Mehta originally identified in Edmund Burke's writings, and I was talking about Burke today, but certainly with respect to Ram Mohan and Ambedkar both, in their departures from the classical liberal political thought. They are pushing, I argue, somewhat humbly, that they are pushing us into a direction of that dangerous, inconclusive terrain where I and thou speak to each other. It is this adventurous space that could be our only way out. Richard Rorty, the neo-pragmatist philosopher, the American pragmatist thinker, says solidarity, because at this point people are haunted by some pressing political, somewhat horrendous political concerns. The question of solidarity, if we understand it as Sumita is fond of saying, bedhe bedhe thaka, then this is how Richard Rorty's idea of solidarity would look like as a way out, as I said, from both the Epicurean ataraxia, quietude, indifference, non-partitioning, not participating into something, and the liberal premise in which you have to intervene. আমাদের লোকগুলোকেই বেশি করে পেটানো দরকার. Remember the first text message from my friend that I read out, and something with which I began this lecture this afternoon. So this is what Richard Rorty says. Solidarity has to be constructed out of little pieces rather than found already waiting in the form of the Ur language, which all of us recognize when we hear it. That tendency to have a common language is the universalistic premise of liberal political thought. Rorty is not interested in it. Rorty is rather interested not in the perfect conversations and arguments that Habermas would encourage us to have, but in the imperfect conversations, inconclusive dialogues, where I and thou are dangerously talking to each other. Solidarity in that sense. Let that be our moment for entering Daya, Koruna, in Ram Mohan, and Karuna, Mudita, and Maitri, the enunciations, the Buddhist enunciations that Dr. Ambedkar had embraced at the fag end of his political career. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for that insightful lecture. Now, with our speaker's permission, we would like to invite questions from the audience, but due to the time limit, we would ask you to keep it very brief, and we'll only be able to take 4 to 5 questions.
Thank you so much, sir, for the insightful lecture. My name is Ishan Chakraborty. I am from American College. So, sir, you in the beginning told us that law mostly focused on the child's education and on the psychological development of the child. So, while listening to it, I was just wondering about Rousseau's philosophy that he talked about in Elaine, where he says that female education should be like close to nature. So, did law mention anything about female education? Whether it will be contrary to the female education or something?
Yeah. Thank you for that question. Because Locke and Rousseau have got very similar pedagogical philosophies and perspectives. No, I'm not. I wasn't really. When I was preparing for this lecture, I wasn't really focusing on the question of male and female education and several distinguishable categories. But I did come across a lot of hierarchizations within the pedagogical philosophy that John Locke put forward. Rousseau also does that, but not in the explicit language of John Locke. So that will be the brief quick response to your question. But you are spot on when you talk about Rousseau here, because both of them are almost on the same page when it comes to education as one of the problems to create political competency, especially power and also language. It ended up on political body, and social contract idea should be premised on, roughly speaking, on that idea of political competency.
Any more questions?
না রোহিতকে প্রশ্ন করতে দেবেন না রোহিতের এখন আমি সংখ্যার কারেন্ট না
Thank you, Professor Das, for the enlightening talk. I'm another one from the Department of Philosophy. I would like to contextualize my question and then I put my question. First of all, there are two stands. One is the universalism of reason and universalism of sentiment. And from your lecture, it is being told to us that law or this liberal political philosophy are all contributing India as on the side of more of universalism of sentiments, or they are barbaring, right? If we accept the very logic of social contract, or if we accept the very foundation of contract, then it is being presumed, at least by laws, that there has to be a symmetry, a reciprocal relationship between the participants in the contract. Given that background, if law is assuming that this colonized world has to be taught certain things in order to make them equal participants in the contract, I am thinking that if we agree with the logic of the contract, I am seeing that is nothing problematic. Right? Number one. Number two, if Locke is saying that these people are non-liberal because they are mostly advocating sentiments rather than reason, universalism of reason and sentiments, thus they are non-liberal. So treating them differently within their framework will not be problematic. Like for example, I am just giving one example. In Rawls, there is one book called Law of People, where he says that these non-liberal people who are not advocates of liberalism should be treated either by economic sanction or by just law. The law will be already just if you go against them, because they are non-liberal. So in a situation like the way we are functioning in today's world, where there is at the one side we all want this kind of liberal policies. On the other hand, there are these sentiments, these pockets of sentiments, who are also marginalized. How do you cope with these two things in the framework, right? Because either you have to subscribe to liberal framework with reason, or you have to subscribe to sentimentalism, which is again charged by relativism. So you cannot stick to one idea of good or truth or right. So sentimentalism means some relativism is there. So how do you cope up with these two things within the framework of liberalism? Be it Locke or be it Brahman or Ambedkar. Because Ambedkar and Brahman, the idea there that we have pointed out, Daya and one is Purna and the common sense, or the and Brahman saying Ambedkar's impatience to have franchise or rights to the poor seems to be non-traditional. So I would like your comment on that.
I think I forgot, thank you for that question. The last part of it seemed a bit convoluted, but I will get back to that. I think I forgot to mention the fact that Ambedkar was partly attacking law, but he continues to operate within some kind of the European price because he wasn't talking about anything other than the adult franchise. So the question of childhood, adulthood stays even at that point. The only one difference that we will be making is to make it universal, to undermine the question of education as competency and so on. This was a tiny soft point that I should have read, but I forgot. Now, to get back to you, I wasn't, I think, in the first part of the way you were putting your question, in the first part there was some confusion about the way I was making these categories following the data. Universalism of sentiments and universalism. I wasn't suggesting by in any way that Locke, Bentham, Mill, they saw these people within some kind of universalism of sentiments against which they have to deploy universalism of reason. They were thinking of making them familiar through their own reason. That was their problem. That is also the fundamental point of their political analysis, because the idea of the political and political thought are inextricable from each other. They cannot be dissociated from each other. They constitute the political. The political is a little for making some interventionist activities. Mentally, it's rather suggesting that we take ourselves away from the political and think of in a Gandhian thing, rather, think of self-improvement through a quest for Shotto and so on. So that pushes us more into the direction of sentiments, Daya, Karuna, Amrita, and so on. Notwithstanding the radical difference between Gandhi and Ambedkar. But the ethos is that. That's the direction. That's the spirit in which they start to think of it. Or I was pushing Mehta's father. To get back to the political dimension of your question, because your question did push us into the direction of certain contemporary events, or the named them children. And some of my students who are present here in this audience are very fond of asking me, how exactly how it and Bishop has also asked the same question, how do you go? And so, I don't know what we should do, really. And I should have added this system right. I would say that we do not, in this talk at least, whatever interventions I have been able to make so far in this direction, I do not have solutions to offer. I have rather raised questions and problems for us. That's a very convenient way of putting it. But that's the best response that I can offer at this point. I'll get back to the slightly more convoluted sections of the last part of your question, but informally we can have a chit chat about that.
Andy.
Hi sir, thank you for the interesting talk. I and Rajoshi Raju for 30% PhD at the Center for Studies in Social Sciences. So, sir, I just was wondering, since you kind of referred to Ramo's invocation of ancient constitution, where did you place the Orientalists in relation to the world political thought?
Any other questions?
Any other question? Do we have any other questions?
না উনি তার ওকে প্রশ্ন ঠিক আছে তাহলে শেষ
Thank you for that question because I was reading up on this lecture. I did come across references to William Jones and Group, and by and large, although the larger discourse politicalism is very much part of the thought, and they have very interesting exchanges between these two discourses. There are many interesting exchanges, but at that point of time, historically speaking, empirically, if you think of it, I think the group of people under the leadership of William Jones were very hierarchical people in Anglo. So empirically that was the case. Discursively there are many activities, interactions, exchanges that did happen, that did inform each other. So the evangelical, Christian, teleological things did have influences on particular thought. And Jones and that brigade were not always comfortable with New Zealand in their pursuits, and they had their own discomforts with the liberal romances of the time. But on hindsight, for all of us, there were many interesting things. That's what I could figure out from what I do.